Had a magnificent week here in Cambridge, England, thanks to Brother Simon Goldhill, dialogue with Brother Paul Gilroy and Sister M.M. McCabe and the novelist Ben Okri. My God, this Cambridge University is quite magnificent. And the tribute to Malcolm X at Sheffield University and the dialogue with Julian Assange. What a week. What a week. Of course, you know that he's been in the Ecuadorian Embassy in London since this past June, a kind of diplomatic asylum, and yet he's strong as ever. I started by asking my brother, how are you feeling?
Not bad. I mean, I won't underestimate the difficulty of being in a situation like this, but strategically things are working quite well. Long ago I asked myself the question when I was in prison, was it all worth it?
Right.
And I did seriously consider the answer, and I became comfortable that when you're engaged in activity where it realizes the principles that you hold dear, not the principles necessarily that the outside world wants you to have, but your inner principles, then you are living your life.
Absolutely.
And there is no other way to live but to live your own life and to try and manifest your principles in the world.
Yes.
And although this situation is difficult, and it is even more difficult for some of our other people, it's a strategic situation that we are slowly winning, and I think the outcome is something that I will be proud of.
Indeed, indeed. I mean, it reminds me in so many ways of the great W.B. Du Bois. When he's 89 years old, he embarked on a trilogy of 3 novels. And he said, I've been wrestling with these questions. This is in the ordeal of Manzard, in the character of Manzard, but it was really Du Bois speaking. He says, how does integrity face oppression? How does honesty face deception? How does decency face insult? And what shall virtue do in the face of brute force? Now that's Du Bois, 89 years old. Brother Julian Assange, 41 years old, 2013, wrestling with great courage, tremendous conviction and commitment and compassion with those same questions. Now, of course, our audience, I think one of the questions our audience would want to know is that given the kind of demonization of you by my government, the U.S. government, what in your mind is their strongest argument against you, just as your strongest argument against their strongest argument will come right in that second question?
There's their most effective argument in terms of effective propaganda, and then there's their strongest intellectual argument,
right.
Which, how long does it survive after you scrutinize it?
Right, that's right.
Their most effective propaganda argument, which is false, is to imply that somehow we have exposed people to retribution and that thousands have been killed. But actually they don't even allege this. It's quite an interesting phenomenon where a government implies something but doesn't actually state it. And then they rely upon the mass media to strip away the qualifiers. Now, for instance, back when we released the Afghan War Diaries, the Pentagon held a press conference stating that I personally or WikiLeaks might already have blood on our hands of some Afghan family or some soldier. And the mass media then immediately took that statement, dropped the might, and removed all qualifiers, and then pushed around the world that, in fact, we had caused the death of Afghan family or some soldier. But in fact, to this date, no government, including the US government, has alleged that even a single person has come to physical harm as a result of any of our publications over the last 6 years. Incredible to see the finesse of making an accusation with a qualifier. Anything might be true, of course, and then knowing that the mainstream press will remove the qualifiers in order to make the statement stronger. But then in terms of their strongest intellectual argument, it is a government in a democracy is mandated by the people who have voted for it. And therefore the decisions as to what is secret or not is the right and proper place of the government. Now that argument falls quite quickly because we have to understand what is the lifeblood of democracy, and the lifeblood of the democracy is information. And in fact, it's the one area where duly elected government, and you can argue about whether the US government is duly elected, is not and should not be able to make decisions about what information people have. And that was recognised early on by framers of the US Constitution and Madison and so on, by mandating not that the press or the rights of the people should be protected by law, but something much more significant, that no law is to be made in relation to the rights of the people to communicate. And that is because every law, every regulation, every constitution comes about as the result of people communicating. They are distillations of people communicating. They are a secondary phenomena to people communicating. So if you ask yourself what regulates the law, what regulates mandate, what regulates constitutional change, it is regulated by the people communicating. Other matters, legislation and so on, are derivative of people communicating. And the only way to hold government to account and modify its behaviour and produce an educated body politic that is able to control its controllers is through the free and robust communication. Government must not be in charge of regulating what the people know about government. That would be a self-regulation that is doomed to failure.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the reason why I personally consider you a courageous freedom fighter is because I discern in your life and in your witness a profound commitment to democracy, of transparency, of publicity. But at the same time, I also discern a profound commitment to liberty, of rights. And I know you got that wonderful slogan of privacy for the weak, transparency for the strong, as it were. Yes. Where do the roots of your commitment to democracy and liberty come from, and how is it that you're willing to pay this cost, though, brother?
My parents were in the theatre, and from a young age, I moved from town to town to town, and across different states in Australia. And each state has a different education system, and different political views, and barracks for different football teams. And my mother was also involved in squirreling information out about the Maralinga atomic test program that the British were doing. And so this gave me an early sense of perspective, that I understood that why there was particular ways of doing things, there was not the way of doing things was not necessarily the only way. And I was of that generation, the last generation before internet education. And I was educated by libraries, many, many different libraries in different places. And I came to understand that what makes us civil and what makes us just is education. Fundamentally, it is education. And you see that in the workers' movements in London in the early 20th century. The primary struggle is always education. It is for people to see themselves with a sense of perspective. And the fight for knowledge is the fight for education. And one cannot be free, one cannot be at liberty until you understand your environment, you understand the other actors in your environment, you understand where society is heading. As to why I would care about liberty at all, I'm not sure. Sometimes I think this is an innate tribute that some people are born with more than others. Everyone's concerned about it, but some people are very concerned about it.
Well, you're certainly willing to act on it more so than most, no doubt. I mean, I think we're here in London, and one of my heroes is R.H. Tawney, who was, of course, a Christian socialist, The Acquisitive Society, his book on equality, fundamentally committed to education, but Paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A, that deep education, not the cheap schooling that goes by the name of education these days, the kind of self-cultivation and self-culture that Emerson and Margaret Fuller and others talked about. And I see you in that tradition, and it's fascinating because in one sense, it's a very traditional sensibility. It goes back to the Greeks. It goes back to Jerusalem in terms of really having the courage to stand up for your convictions in a self-critical way, but still committed to rights on the one hand, but also transparency on the other. And I.F. Stone used to tell us all governments lie And we know all empires hide and conceal secrets, usually associated with what Brother Jeremy Scahill talks about with dirty wars, as it were. But it's a matter of just making it available, making it transparent. In your text, it's a scary text. In some ways, it's a very bleak one. You see mass surveillance, mass control. This cryptography as the last form of non-violent direct action, echoes of Martin Luther King Jr. And you know what he means to you, you know what he means to me. Tell us something about your present reading of our contemporary situation in light of the struggle against mass surveillance, Domin.
Well, you just mentioned Martin Luther King. He was just cited in a court case about us where the Department of Justice, National Security Division, and the FBI, who are the principal protagonists against us in the United States now, have been withholding lists of our supporters and other information they've collected about us. So there's ongoing litigation trying to force them into obeying the law and to handing over that information about what their activities are. And Martin Luther King was a target of the FBI and the COINTELPRO program. And it was revealed at that stage that America had a political police. And the political police is the FBI, and they're back into that game in a big way. Well, I encourage people to try and look that up, the EPIC case, EPIC, relating to WikiLeaks. Now, in terms of mass surveillance, we are at a very disturbing time. And I present it as a book at a crossroads. People often do that, but I think it really is true. Just 2 days ago, a former FBI counterterrorism agent came out on CNN and accidentally, it seems, let slip that all American telephone calls are being recorded, even domestically. Now, a lot of evidence is given in Cypherpunks from various court cases and statements to Congress and leaks that have come out about how the US government is recording all United States to other countries' telephone traffic. So if you're in the US and you call a friend in Europe, then how that's recorded, all the email is recorded, all the SMSs are recorded. For Latin America, the telecommunications flows through Latin America, go through the United States on the way to the rest of the world, where they're intercepted by the National Security Agency, recorded and indexed. And this is something that would have once been from a science fiction horror movie, but now this is not just large government departments like the National Security Agency involved, where it's been reported in the Washington Post they intercept 1.7 billion communications per day.
My God.
Keep in mind the population of Earth is only going on 8 billion. But they're now engaged in high levels of domestic surveillance. The National Core Register, which is what they were compiling over several years, is the communications records for the telephone system of every person calling every other person in the United States. And you say, well, so what? What does it matter if the National Security Agency and its various contractor cronies and the FBI have access to all the call records of everyone you've ever called on your telephone? The issue is, and most people may not understand this, that algorithms, automated systems have been generated to pull all that data together, to instantly discover all the communities within the United States. You have a group of people who tend to call each other, another group of people who tend to call each other. Groups are connected to groups, different activist groups, different political groups, different companies, etc., etc. And automatically, once you have that information, you can lay out the entire community and political structure of the United States. And that has been done. These techniques are progressing. If you look at wikileaks.org/spy files, you can see that we've released details of over 100 different companies involved in this game. The prospectuses secret prospectuses that they give to US intelligence agencies and other agencies from around the world, selling bulk interception gear, strategic interception gear. It's not just about Martin Luther King anymore. It's not just finding the top activists, spying on them and their closest associates. It's everyone. Why would the National Security Agency be interested in everyone? Why would the FBI be interested in everyone? It's just cheaper to spy on everyone. It's cheaper to spy on everyone than particular people to spy on. The system is automated. Once you've set up the interception gear at the key choke points of where the big telecommunications hubs are from AT&T and others. If you're monitoring all that for a particular person, why not just take it for every person?
It's applied right across the board.
It's applied right across the board.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
the way this is spoken about within the mass surveillance industry is that there has been a sea change from tactical surveillance to strategic surveillance. Tactical surveillance is what we think about when we think about surveillance. A few activists who are targeted, a few drug dealers who are targeted. Strategic surveillance is just take it all.
Mm-hmm.
Take it all, keep it all, index it all, make it all searchable, automatically transcribe it, lay it out automatically into clusters of communities, and then whenever you are interested in someone, you can go back in time. You can go back in time to look at all their connections and correspondence. And if you have 10 years worth of intercepts about a person, you can find something, you can find some excuse if you want one to arrest them.
And we've seen that in the history of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover and a host of others.
This is, automated J. Edgar Hoover at a massive scale.
A massive scale.
Not even just the United States, but all of Latin America, most of the transatlantic traffic coming across from Europe to the United States.
But I mean, this is Orwell on steroids, though, isn't it? This is Big Brother on steroids.
Well, we don't just have a TV that can spy us now. People are walking around with smartphones, and every smartphone is a tracking device that also makes calls. It's undreamt of that these smartphones are revealing the cell location, so down to about 250 meters. If you look at the product literature sold to the intelligence agencies, it's 50 to 250 meters. Each person has been tracked just by walking around with this. It's not that they've been individually tracked; it's a mass tracking. The other day, Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, announced that there were 1 million new Android phone registrations per day. How does he know there's 1 million per day? How he knows is because every one of those phones reports back to Google, every single one. 1 million per day. Can you imagine if the Black Panthers were getting 1 million new members per day, if WikiLeaks was getting 1 million new employees or sources per day? That's the sort of game that these big companies are involved in. And you go, okay, yeah, that's just Google. It's, it provides a search service, an email. So what? What does it matter if it's connected to all these phones? Well, Google has made a strategic decision to enmesh itself within the core of US establishment power within the State Department. Eric Schmidt, together with Jared Cohen, have released a book that they're right now pushing all around the world about the future of the world and the future of the United States and what is it going to be. Jared Cohen is a former advisor to Hillary Clinton and a former advisor to Rice. The back of the book has a list of endorsements, not endorsements from Cornel West, not endorsements from Julian Assange, but rather endorsements from Madeleine Albright, from Clinton, from Henry Kissinger, from Tony Blair. It's aimed at pulling together Google as the largest new corporation in the United States with these central elements of traditional US conservative power.
I can just say this, though, brother, that I can reassure you that Martin Luther King Jr., if he were alive, would stand on the side of freedom, democracy, and liberty, and even pay the ultimate cost, as you know he did, and the tremendous cost you're paying now, and many of us are also willing to pay. And yet it means there's a different kind of red line. Let's put it this way. There's a different kind of red line. Looks like the red line these days is a red line defending individual rights against expanding autocratic, authoritarian, and totalitarian powers, almost like rewriting Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, the middle part of the barbaric 20th century. Now we've got these very subtle and not so subtle mechanisms that extend totalitarianism and, as you say, militarize cyberspace to such a degree that we've got these voices in our bedrooms like a soldier in your under your bed, as it were.
Well, we've cast ourselves, the societies across the West have merged themselves with the internet, and the internet has also merged with societies. There is no boundary between the two now. So what happens to the internet happens to society. What happens to society happens to the internet. And what has happened to the internet is mass surveillance at a mass scale, automated propaganda at a mass scale. And you go, well, how does that affect individuals? Well, husbands and wives communicate using mobile phones, which run over the internet. They email each other, which goes over the internet. Activists coordinate with each other, which goes over the internet. Financial transactions go over the internet. In other words, the classic elements of civilian space, of civilian society, of our normal day-to-day honest human interactions and our organised group interactions are surveilled by the military. They're surveilled by the national security complex. So the intimacy that is between a husband and wife in terms of their online chats or their emails or their SMSs between each other, what's in the middle of it? Well, the military is in the middle of it. So there has been a military occupation now of cyberspace. Because cyberspace has merged with regular human society, there's effectively a military occupation of civilian life.
But given this triumph, though, of mendacity and hypocrisy and falsity, it reminds me in some ways of the old Hasidic story about the truth being put in a grave. How can the truth emerge under conditions of mass surveillance, mass control, overwhelming hypocrisy and mendacity? We got to go back to the coat skirt that the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used to wrestle with. Can the truth, can veracity ever emerge, though, brother?
The truth is hidden through two phenomena: secrecy and complexity. And education understanding is needed to defeat complexity, and organisations like WikiLeaks and courageous insiders are needed to defeat secrecy. Now, the picture I painted before of it's galloping now, this mass surveillance, transnational mass surveillance state. We are galloping towards that. Yeah. And it's coming to be that they're not even bothering to keep it secret now. These are giant mass surveillance industry conferences, for example. They're barely secret now. And we've gotten people into half a dozen of them, collecting their materials and so on. And you look at other statements made to Congress and information coming out in court cases. This statement made the other night on CNN where the FBI, former counterintelligence expert, admitted the mass surveillance of US telephone calls. So they're so comfortable with it that it is unstoppable, that they're willing even not to be secret about it. So how can we fight against this? Is there any hope at all? Is there an extremely grim picture?
Right.
Yes, there is. If we look, say, for example, at what that Correa in Ecuador, although there was a crackdown against Ecuador in relation to it giving me asylum, Correa won with an increased majority. And there seems to be a growing independence of Latin America. How can that be when there's such an increase in sophistication of mass surveillance, particularly of Latin American communications?
Right.
Well, the speed of all our communications is also increasing between each other. I spoke before about 1 million new Android phones a day, yes, reporting back all sorts of details about people to Google where they're harvestable by US federal agencies. On the other hand, that is 1 million new phones a day and people communicating very, very quickly. There's a lateral transfer of information. So yes, the mass surveillance state is harvesting, and it's the greatest theft that has ever occurred in history, the communications of most individuals in the West, harvesting them, pulling them up to those people who already have extraordinary power, are getting more. Organizations like WikiLeaks are involved in pulling information down, taking it from very powerful groups and putting it to the commons. But the largest phenomena is the lateral transfer. It's what happened in the early 20th century in London, the United States, where you had workers' collectives educating each other, teaching each other. People who couldn't, there was no formalized university education for these people, but they would write books and teach each other. What we're also seeing on the internet is massive education of individuals in the world educating each other, small organizations educating each other. And that mass lateral transfer, that mass education, has produced a time of the greatest political education that has ever occurred, is happening right now. All over the world. The breaking of the manufacture of consent is happening right now, especially for people under the age of 30. And this new generation of politically educated people, where are they going to go? Well, the CIA has to hire these people. You cannot hire a person now who is talented in any field without them having had extensive exposure to the internet. And so that also means exposure to the values that are emerging as a result of the internet. And those values are values of liberty, the rights of communication. They fall out naturally from the medium. And so as a result, moles, effectively our ideological moles are infiltrating every powerful organization. And that creates a check on the power of these organizations that they must, in order to be functional, they must not alienate the people within inside them to such a degree that those people start throwing a spanner in their works or pumping out information.
But tell me what you think about this. I mean, when I look at, for example, Obama administration, the vicious treatment of the whistleblowers, the use of the Espionage Act more than any other administration, with about 3 uses of it since 1917. It's about 6 uses in the last few years, which is a way of demonizing courageous folk trying to disclose information. And yet at the same time, the distance from the Wall Street criminality, the distance from executives who are involved in insider trading, market manipulation, they're sipping tea at the White House. Certainly that creates a culture of fear. When you talk about education, and we can go back to the early part of the 20th century, and back to R.H. Tawney and some of the others, they always injected a strong dose of courage along with that education. What I see now is a lot of very smart people who are cowardly, who are willing to be well adjusted to injustice. Where does the courage of a Julian Assange, of a brother Bradley Manley, of a brother John Chiardu, where does that come from? How do we make that more contagious?
When I was young, I had the view that intelligence was the rare commodity, and it was a delight to find that anywhere. And when I got a little bit older, I had the view that courage was the rare commodity.
I mean, a lot of Nazis were smart and intelligent, Goebbels, and a lot of white supremacists, male supremacists, homophobes, anti-Semites, anti-Arab. Some of them are very, very, very smart, but lack courage and compassion. Yeah. How do we get that in the education?
And the courage was the rare commodity and needed to be fostered.
Absolutely.
Fear is contagious, but courage is also contagious. And so I think, in my experience, I don't know the answer to your question precisely, but in my experience, when people see that courageous men or women succeed in enforcing their principles, that is tremendously encouraging. I mean, those people become role models, and others try and take it on. I think it's not that courage can be taught. I don't think it can be taught, but it can be followed. People have often come to me and said, well, Julian, you're fearless. And I say, not at all. You completely misunderstand. I feel every fear that every other person does. But I don't recoil from the fear. I try and understand the fear. And is it a legitimate fear? Is it really coming out of the situation, the real facts and circumstances of the situation? Or is it prejudice? And so I think through courageous thinking, you can think past your fears, and that is something that other people can follow in. And when you have encountered a number of situations where you have successfully thought past your fears, then you develop some self-confidence that you can do it again and again and again.
Powerful. I mean, you might recall in Plato's dialogues on what is courage, namely the Laches, he makes a distinction between rashness, boldness, and fearlessness, and courage still being different. Courage may in fact look like those others,
yes,
but it's tied to some kind of ability to look through the fear, work through the fear with a telos, with an end, with an aim. And usually, and this is what Plato doesn't add, and see, I'm a blues man, so I got to bring back memory, right? I think it has something to do with things you remember, people you remember, values you revere, tied to your memory, as it were. And when you think of your own witness right now, what memories keep you going? Which figures inspire you to be courageous as opposed to simply being fearless?
It's an interesting question. Initially, there was no figure. I had no mentor. There was no figure that I looked up to in the sense that I thought that I was close to them or could become them. That's something interesting about very young men, and I assume young women as well, that because you're so young, you don't see, I couldn't see Martin Luther King, for example, as a role model, not because he was American, not because he was black. I could probably get past those things, but simply because he was a lot older than me. And in fact, it has only been recently where I've encountered at a deep level people who I've grown to respect, that I have seen them under fire. And I've seen the trade-offs that they have to make in their own life. So I've grown to respect them in people like John Pilger, for example, who's become a close friend. It's an interesting question you have. Can you really relate to someone from a distance if you haven't personally seen them under fire? Bradley Manning, of course, I have personally seen him under fire where he's been in a very grim situation in the US prison system, and where they tried to get him to crack using a whole lot of methods. Tried to get him to crack against me personally. Only 5'2", a young man. They weren't able to make him to crack, and you hear back from his support team that one of the reasons is that the more that they pushed him, the more he saw how unjust they were, how immoral their position was. That is probably something that I've seen in common with courageous people, that the more that they are pushed in an immoral way, in an illegitimate way, the more they instinctively push back.
And the raw stuff that goes into that kind of courage, just the sheer grit of saying, this is the kind of person I want to be. Back to Du Bois. This is the kind of integrity I want. This is the kind of decency. This is the kind of honesty. And in the end, it doesn't have anything to do with the isms. It has to do with, this is the kind of human being Brother Julian chooses to be.
In my early 20s, I was involved in a big case in Australia, and the police were trying to convert a number of people in informers. In fact, close friends in that case became a secret informer against me for 6 months. They tried to do it to me as well, and I could see that strategically there might be some short-term benefit in it. But then that's not the sort of person I wanted to be. It's precisely the sort of thinking I had. And it's not that I worried about, well, what will my community think of me or what will my friends think of me. It's not even that I was concerned about what I would think of me. It's that once you succumb in such a manner, then how can you possibly defend yourself? How can you possibly defend your character throughout life if you succumb in that way? You set a precedent to yourself of succumbing, and I think we must all fight to set precedents to ourselves about how our character will act in certain circumstances. To be courageous emancipates our own character, and every interaction that we have with the world, we have through the lens of our own character. So perhaps for every person, their primary task is to strengthen and emancipate their own character, because how can they emancipate other people?
You know, I'm doing this stuff at Cambridge University, and so I'm connecting this stuff. Yeah, I just did a thing on Thursday with Paul Gilroy. I got something tomorrow and on philosophy, and then another one on literature.
They're not too bad at Cambridge, actually.
They're hungry and thirsty, man.
Yeah, I had a big talk there in 2011. It was packed, and even though the press climate here, the mainstream media press climate is probably it's more hostile here than it is in the United States.
Really?
Yeah.
In the UK?
In the United States, you have different points of power in the media. Unfortunately, they're all coming together.
Right.
But you have East Coast versus West Coast. This is a
Right.
trivial example.
Right. Right.
And also because the economy is bigger, there's more sort of niches in the media economy. Here, it's just London. There is just one nasty media patronage group here in London, where everyone's interconnected and goes to the same clubs. And at the elite level, nearly all of them go to Oxford and emerge out of a program at Oxford called PPE.
World famous.
It's like a sort of educational Freemasonry. And that's what the BBC called it. The educational Freemasonry that dominates London.
My God, that's funny.
It's a better predictor of entry into establishment power than Eton. It's twice as good a predictor.
Wow.
6 members of cabinet went to PPE, and the nasty ones: the Prime Minister, William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, Theresa May, the Home Secretary. All emerge out of this PPE. Even Rupert Murdoch.
Murdoch, I'm surprised he made it through. I'm surprised he made it through. Lord. Good God Almighty.
So the sort of
the hegemony
the nasty
is just so tight.
Yeah, because it's one city, and everyone it's nasty.
And incestuous.
There's also never been a proper revolution here. Because in the US, you did have one,
Right.
and in continental Europe, you also in First World War and Second World War, you had occupation and liberation, and then sometimes reoccupation. But it pressed the reset button in the class structure.
Yes, that's right.
So it
That's right.
not completely, but eliminated a lot of the class structure.
But you've got a tremendous
And in fact,
popularity there.
Cambridge
Yeah.
we have one enemy from Cambridge, a dozen from this Oxford PPE thing.
Wow. And any help I can be, or anytime you can use my name to support what you're doing, do not hesitate.
Thank you. Yeah, we
Yeah.
will.
No, absolutely.
It's one of these situations. People make these offers, but because we're in such a big fight, we take them all. But
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, I would have blurted the book if you would have liked that, but anything like that. I mean,
in terms of timetabling, June 3rd, Bradley Manning's case is meant to start. 12 weeks, 141 prosecution witnesses. They're bringing the guys who killed Bin Laden as the star diva. This is a 12-week Broadway musical, a show trial. 38 witnesses will be testifying in a closed court hearing. They have withheld 30,000 pages of judgments in the pre-trial. 30,000 pages of judgment, not even the judgments that they have made public. 30,000 pages. It is the biggest case in US military history.
My God.
The Pentagon gave a 40-minute press conference back in 2010 to the world, demanding from the organisation and me personally that we destroy everything we had ever published from the Pentagon, that we destroy everything that we were going to publish, that we cease soliciting information from US government employees. Not saying about bribing or paying, just cease asking for information from US government employees, or else we would be compelled, precise word they use, compelled to do so. They set the frame on what the battle was. Destroy everything that we previously published, destroy everything we were going to publish, and as an organisation, cease to exist, cease to get new information. They lost every single one of those. We've not taken down a single thing we've published. We have published everything that we wanted to publish from the US military, and we have not ceased operations. And so that complete loss of what they defined as the war has led to a loss of face. They reissued this threat September 28th last year, and we laughed. We laughed because
we've been doing what we wanted to do.
Threats that are not carried out inflate so quickly. So we just laughed at the second one. But the humiliation. Can you imagine now the Pentagon goes to Mali or to North Korea or some other country? We demand that you or we will compel you to do so. It means nothing now. And that is the humiliation that they must make up. And they're focused in doing that in just two ways. First of all, they've got an insider. Yeah, there's only one name on the table as an insider, Bradley Manning. Perhaps we have other sources there, but they've got one that they say that they're going to go for. So hence the 12-week prosecution of such tremendous scale to set that example. Then they have to also go for the outside as well. And so they're going for WikiLeaks, the organisation, and me as a symbol for WikiLeaks, the organisation.
So you and WikiLeaks would be integral to that whole military trial?
There's this 3-year investigation that has been, quote, of unprecedented scale and nature in relation to us. They call it internally a whole-of-government investigation. It's probably involved over a dozen agencies. It's under Neil McBride, the DA, sort of the extraterritorial DA. Wow. They've got a grand jury and pulling all sorts of people in. So that's their focus, to restore authority, go for a simple young man inside the military, try and pump him up to be as big as possible so they can smash him down. And then also for us as an outside organisation, and then me personally as the symbolic leader for the outside organisation. Right. And what is happening? I've been watching closely what has been happening with the FBI because of our involvement with the FBI. And we've been, even though our case has not formally started yet, the investigation formally started three years ago, and there's been lots of subpoenas for. They've been pulling information out about Google. They've been pulling information at US ISPs out of Twitter. They've been coercively forcing my friends in the United States to testify before the grand jury, even after they plead the Fifth and so on. And that caused a number of secondary legal cases. Like we fight these subpoenas in court. We fight to get Freedom of Information Acts that they deny because they say there's an ongoing investigation. We fight to understand the informers and so on. And the FBI has its role in political policing in the United States. It never disappeared after these church hearings.
That's right.
But they tried to keep their head down a bit, and now it's just like this.
Escalating.
They're not waiting for a reported victim, like someone to make a complaint. They're doing this political policing long before that, and they're even ceasing to, in their internal documentation, to try and make it look like what they're doing is part of a proper policing investigation. The language is starting to, they talk about people being destabilizing.
Oh, right. But one last point before you go. How can I best be of service to your cause, and how can the work in the state contribute to this, both disclosing of truth, that's in part what this interview is about, but also on other scales and dimensions, don't we?
I'm not certain, because I'm not certain of all your contacts and all the things you can do.
The idea of speech is,
There's all, the things that that you're good at, but that's why I framed that there's these upcoming events.
So June 3rd, 12 weeks, and then
the things you can slot into. There appears to be, my lawyers say 60% chance of a secret indictment already present for me in the United States, coming out of this grand jury. A sealed indictment. And
do they have secret indictments without anybody even knowing about it?
And the law is that it is a criminal offence for any US official to reveal the existence of a secret indictment, even to another US official, unless the other US official is involved in grabbing the person. So, and then the process here into the UK, they also have sealed extradition orders. So even if the Swedish case drops tomorrow, and that's looking all very good. The women have admitted,
that thing was so
women
weak.
Have admitted,
so weak anyway.
They've admitted
zero.
So
that's basically gone in a way.
Politically, this is almost gone in Sweden. So that will drop soon enough. But then, can I walk out of this embassy? No, I still can't walk out of this embassy because of the sealed indictment.
Would your lawyers even be able to know whether it's a sealed indictment or not?
No, we have tried, according to the Department of Justice's own guidelines for prosecutors, they are meant to say whether you are the target, subject, or witness in a grand jury investigation, unless there's extraordinary reasons why they shouldn't. And they are refusing to speak. We know that it's Neil McBride. We know the people who are responsible. they will not speak. And the interpretation by US lawyers who dealt with a lot of these cases is there's only one grounds which they could have for refusing to talk about what my status is. And that is if there's been a sealed indictment, because it would be a criminal offence for them to say anything about it. So
Exactly.
they refuse to talk about it. And in terms of the staging, this Bradley Manning case and the criminal aspect of this massive US investigation against me is that I engaged in a conspiracy with Bradley Manning. Well, a number of different. They have about 6 different attacks that I published information that they say was classified and that therefore is espionage in the distribution sense. In the Espionage Act, to distribute classified information is espionage. The problem there is that some of the European extradition treaties don't permit extradition for classically political offences, and espionage is one of them.
Okay.
Also, that would embroil possibly the US newspapers. They would fight against it because they also published some of our information.
Right.
So they have other attacks. The other attacks are to say that there's encrypted video of a massacre and that we broke the encryption of this video. And that is more than a normal journalist does. And that is, I'm somehow involved in the conspiracy to liberate this encrypted information. And then another approach that we moved federal government information worth more than $1,000 across interstate lines. And so they have a number of different approaches. However, they all involve some, apart from the publishing, all involve some interaction with me and Bradley Manning. So his trial will succeed in some ways, but fail in other ways, etc. But they obviously can't charge me with conspiracy for an act which Bradley Manning is acquitted for.
Right.
Who am I conspiring with, right?
That's right.
So we view that it will be probably the very end of the Bradley Manning proceedings, just after, that then the case against us, they've been doing this massive investigation, but going from the investigative phase to the prosecutorial phase, this will activate
I see.
at the end of the proceedings. That said, the US has been known, there was an espionage case that came out just recently, to keep these sealed indictments secret for a long time. So the one that came out just recently was 9 years. They kept the indictment sealed. That's difficult. And this is why being here and being awarded formally political asylum is part of a much bigger play on our part. We know that we're not just dealing with what happens this year. We know that me personally and the organisation is dealing, we have a 15, 20 year battle here, because that indictment, if it stays there after the Bradley Manning case, they will try and serve that indictment for the next 20 years.
Next 20 years.
Until the politics changes enough to stop it, they will try and serve that indictment. And if it becomes public that they have an indictment, we're after him, we're going to get him. If they start doing that rhetoric, which is what the Pentagon did, remember, they said, we're going to compel you not to do this, that there will be so much prestige involved that they can never get rid of it. They will have to pursue it forever. We saw a case in Sweden of a US military serviceman. He just went AWOL in 1982. No crime against him alleged other than desertion. And he found his way to Sweden and then hid there in a secret identity. He wasn't given refugee status or something. The Swedes stopped doing that in the early 70s. Hid there in a secret identity. Eventually it came out. It came out when I came in here, actually. It's because people were looking at these sort of situations. So what happened? Within 2 weeks, US Army prosecutors, investigators went to Sweden trying to take his DNA. And that was 1982.
That was 30 years ago.
Yeah. So 30 years, and they haven't forgotten. Why not? Because, well, if he says, hey, I got away with it. The lack of authority, the reduction in authority, reduction in prestige is intolerable. So they have to do the opposite, which is increase their authority. We never forget. anyone who defies our authority, even if it's 30 years, even if it's a trivial thing, just desertion, we're going to get them.
My God, well, I'll tell you, we keep swinging. I'm telling you.
In the US, we're getting good support in the US. It's solid people.
We've got to intensify, though. I mean, we've got to intensify, and we got to make some of these connections. You know what I mean? So that when we talk about the new Jim Crow, what we try to do on the radio show is, make the connections, because you begin to see the kind of correlation.
Our strongest supporters in the US are people who went through the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Because they understand what the FBI was like in that period.
Absolutely. That's why I was so glad we were able to bring Martin in and make it, because Martin still has a certain status in the States. You know what I mean? And so when I talked
you saw bloody Obama, with his hand on Martin Luther King's
But I don't know whether you all saw the C-SPAN thing that I did on Martin. We putting on King's Bible. And
what was that?
Yeah, and I talked about how Martin was against the carpet bombing in Vietnam. He'd be against the drones dropping bombs on innocent people, especially 219 innocent children. I said, but not only that, Martin would be either assassinated or in detention without judicial process because he was connected to Nelson Mandela, which is defined as a terrorist group. And based on the National Defense Authorization Act, you can't have associations with a terrorist group, be it associated forces or what have you. I said, so Martin would be, under Obama administration, detained without due process, or maybe even assassinated. And this is on national TV. We put that on. Everybody said, God, Brother West has lost his mind. No, I'm telling the truth.
It was only 1998 that Nelson Mandela was taken off
the terrorist list. Yeah. That's exactly right. But I know, again, I don't want to interrupt today, but this is such a blessing in terms of inspiration. We got to march out of this place together in a few months. You let me know. That's the truth.
Well, there's being in here is important strategically. I spoke about us getting a formal asylum. That's brought Latin America on side in a very important way.
That's right.
But this case against us for the past 3 years. It is so complex. It involves so many U.S. departments. It is so big and so secret. It's hard for people to imagine it. But there's just two things that are imaginable in this case. One is the condition of this young soldier brother man in prison.
That's right.
The other is this physical circumstance. The physical circumstance of the embassy, and this, it's like a fulcrum with all these British police. That's sort of big surveillance van out there.
Right.
And there's events in terms of on the balcony or people coming in or out. We had a joke that for Christmas we should send 12 Santas in 13 out. And then they would arrest the 13th Santa.
Oh my God.
The handcuffs.
Oh wow.
That's fascinating. It's an environment where we can generate this, simplify the political understanding through an easily physically imaginable circumstance. There's a man trapped in a building.
Right.
And then when people have that window into all the complexity.
Well, let me say on behalf of millions that when we look at your courage, when we look at your what Jane Austen calls constancy, moral consistency, you are a profound inspiration. And of course, as a Christian, I'm praying for you, brother. But even my secular brothers and sisters, we not only think pleasant thoughts, but we know that you're part of a great tradition, the Daniel Ellsbergs and others, and many more to come as well. And let us continue to struggle, keeping the love, keeping the courage, and most importantly, keeping that deep sense of character. Love and respect you, my brother.
You too.
Absolutely, definitely. If you want to hear the complete conversation, please go to smilingwest.com or just download the podcast.
You can catch me weeknights on my TV show on PBS.
And you can catch me Saturday, May 18th at the Afrocentricity Conference with my dear brother Malefe Asante and others in Philadelphia.
The conversation continues 7 days a week on our website, smilingwest.com. You can call our Speak Out Network hotline anytime, toll free at 855-SPEAK-OUT.
Smiling West is produced by SRP Productions and distributed by PRI, Public Radio International. The views expressed on this program are very much our own and do not necessarily represent the views of PRI or this station.
Our producer is Joe Zephyr, our engineer, the legendary Johnny Morris. This program mixed and recorded in the Cheryl Flowers Radio Studios here in Los Angeles.
Special thanks this week to Brother Leo Harnack from Cambridge, England. I'm Cornel West. Stay strong, my brothers and sisters of all colors.
And in Los Angeles, I'm Tavis Smiley. This is PRI. Keep the faith.
The kind of demonization of you by my government, the U.S. government. What in your mind is their strongest argument against you, just as your strongest argument against their strongest argument will come right in that second question?
There's their most effective argument in terms of effective propaganda, and then there's their strongest intellectual argument,
right.
Which, you know, how long does it survive after you scrutinize it?
Right, that's right.
Their most effective propaganda argument, which is false, is to imply that somehow we have exposed people to retribution and that thousands have been killed. But actually, they don't even allege this. It's quite an interesting phenomenon where a government implies something but doesn't actually state it. And then they rely upon the mass media to strip away the qualifiers. Now, for instance, back when we released Afghan War Diaries, the Pentagon held a press conference stating that I personally or WikiLeaks might already have blood on our hands of some Afghan family or some soldier. And the mass media then immediately took that statement, dropped the might, and removed all qualifiers, and then pushed around the world that, in fact, Institution and Madison and so on, by mandating not that the press or the rights of the people should be protected by law, but something much more significant, that no law is to be made in relation to the rights of the people to communicate. And that is because every law, every regulation, every constitution comes about as the result of people communicating. They are distillations of people communicating. They are a secondary phenomena to people communicating. So if you ask yourself what regulates the law, what regulates mandate, what regulates constitutional change, it is regulated by the people communicating. Other matters, legislation and so on, are derivative of people communicating. And the only way to hold government to account and modify its behaviour and produce an educated body politic that is able to control its controllers is through the free and robust communication. Government must not be in charge of regulating what the people know about government. That would be a self-regulation that is doomed to failure.
Mm-hmm.
We had caused the death of Afghan family or some soldier, but in fact, to this date, no government, including the US government, has alleged that even a single person has come to physical harm as a result of any of our publications over the last 6 years. Incredible to see the finesse of making an accusation with a qualifier. Anything might be true, of course, and then knowing that the mainstream press will remove the qualifiers in order to make the statement stronger. Then in terms of their strongest intellectual argument, it is a government in a democracy is mandated by the people who have voted for it. And therefore the decisions as to what is secret or not is the right and proper place of the government. Now that argument falls quite quickly because we have to understand what is the lifeblood of a democracy, and the lifeblood of a democracy is information. And in fact, it's the one area where duly elected government, and you can argue about whether the US government is duly elected, is not and should not be able to make decisions about what information people have. And that was recognized early on by framers of the US Constitution.
I've had a magnificent week here in Cambridge, England, thanks to Brother Simon Goldhill, dialogue with Brother Paul Gilroy and Sister M.M. McCabe and the novelist Ben Okri. My God, this Cambridge University is quite magnificent. And the tribute to Malcolm X at Sheffield University and the dialogue with Julian Assange. What a week. What a week. Of course, you know that he's been in the Ecuadorian Embassy in London since this past June, a kind of diplomatic asylum, and yet he's strong as ever. I started by asking my brother, how are you feeling?
Not bad. I mean, I won't underestimate the difficulty of being in a situation like this, but strategically things are working quite well. Long ago I asked myself the question when I was in prison, was it all worth it?
Right.
And I did seriously consider the answer, and I became comfortable that when you're engaged in activity where it realizes the principles that you hold dear, not the principles necessarily that the outside world wants you to have, but your inner principles, then you are living your life.
Absolutely.
And there is no other way to live but to live your own life and to try and manifest your principles in the world.
Yes.
And although this situation is difficult, and it is even more difficult for some of our other people, it's a strategic situation that we are slowly winning, and I think the outcome is something that I will be proud of.
Indeed, indeed. I mean, it reminds me in so many ways of, the great W.B. Du Bois. When he was 89 years old, he embarked on a trilogy of 3 novels. And he said, I've been wrestling with these questions. This is in the ordeal of Manzart, in the character of Manzart, but it was really Du Bois speaking. He says, how does integrity face oppression? How does honesty face deception? How does decency face insult? And what shall virtue do in the face of brute force? Now that's Du Bois, 89 years old. Brother Julian Assange, 41 years old, 2013, wrestling with great courage, tremendous conviction and commitment and compassion with those same questions. Now, of course, our audience, I think one of the questions our audience would want to know is that given the